Hello, everyone. Welcome to this presentation on how to write an advocacy abstract for the International Conference on Family Planning. This content was developed by the Advocacy and Accountability Subcommittee of the conference. Today, I will share with you the key elements and important considerations that will help you to prepare your abstract for the conference and increase your chances of being accepted for the presentation. You may also find tips shared in this presentation useful for other advocacy writing and publications. So in this presentation, we will go through why you should present at ICFP, the main sections of the research abstracts for ICFP, namely the title, advocacy intervention or activity tested, methodology, results and key findings, and policy or program implications. First, why present your research at ICFP? There are many reasons to present at ICFP. Most importantly, you are contributing to the field of family planning with new knowledge. It is also an opportunity for you to disseminate the findings from your advocacy intervention and learn from other similar interventions, as well as raise awareness about the lessons learned from your efforts. ICFP is an opportunity to develop new skills and practices through interactions with other researchers, advocates, service providers, program implementers, and policymakers. And finally, your presentation at ICFP contributes to your professional development. As you work on your abstract, keep in mind the purpose of an advocacy abstract. There are multiple purposes to an advocacy abstract. One purpose is, of course, to demonstrate to reviewers the relevance of your program and findings. But there are other purposes as well. If you are accepted, your abstract will provide a brief summary of your advocacy intervention that attendees can review and use to decide whether to attend your session. So it's important that it conveys the importance and outcomes of your advocacy intervention. Additionally, abstracts from conferences are frequently posted online, and this means that others in the field may review them even after the conference. So the advocacy abstract must accurately and succinctly summarize the purpose, the methodology, key findings, and policy or program implications for others to review. To meet these objectives, your abstract should be clear and succinct, accurate, and complete. Remember that an abstract is a package and as a whole should be able to tell your story. Avoid jargon and confusing language and make sure that your results are correct. Do not leave any sections blank or incomplete and respect the word count of each section of the abstract. This system will cut off additional words, so if you go over the word limit, reviewers will not be able to see what you've written. Let's take a few minutes and go through each section of a research abstract. First, the title. Why is a title important? It's the first thing that people will see, and if the title of your abstract isn't relevant or interesting, people won't read the abstract itself. So spend some time on the title. The title is your headline and will appear as the mini advertisement for your session in the conference program. The title should be short, specific, informative, and snappy. It should summarize your activity in 15 words or less. Whenever possible, use descriptive terms and phrases that accurately summarize your advocacy and give a sense of the scope of your efforts and the location of your intervention. Make your abstract stand out. Make it sound like something you'd be interested in attending and differentiate the abstract from others on the same subject. What is it about your advocacy effort that is new or different from other people's? As you may imagine, we receive many very good titles and a good number of titles that are not so well crafted. Below are a few examples from previous ICFPs that we thought were good examples. The Act Now to End Teenage Pregnancy campaign. Multi-sectoral partnerships, media and mass mobilization drive results in Uganda. Fostering subnational accountability through innovative, decision-maker-led internal assessment for FP commitments in Kenya. From policy to action, expanding health worker roles for comprehensive abortion care in India. Business case for investing in family planning in Nigeria, 2018 to 2020, cost-benefit analysis. There's no one correct way to write a title, as you can see, and there are many different approaches you can take. Many people think because it's an academic conference that it has to sound academic, but there really is some room for personality. Now let's discuss what should be in the significance and background section. Remember to stick to the word limit in each section. In this case, that is no more than 200 words. In this section of the abstract, you should make sure you clearly describe why your study was necessary, since this is the introduction to your efforts. This section should answer, what is the status of family planning in your context? What problem are you addressing? Why was advocacy needed? It's good to remember that abstract reviewers don't always do the things you do. So tailor your writing to someone who knows a little bit about family planning in general, but maybe not very much about family planning in your specific country context. One big insight tip for this section is not to give the background story of the development of your advocacy tool or intervention. There's a different section for that. Instead, the significance and background section is your before snapshot. It should describe your particular setting prior to your advocacy or accountability activities and why they were needed in the first place. Here is an example from a previous ICFP advocacy abstract. I will pause for a moment so that you can quickly review, and then we will discuss some key components. Now let's discuss how this section fulfills the criteria that were described in previous slides. You'll note that in this section, the authors quickly describe the problem that the advocacy addressed. In the first paragraph, the author introduces the context in which the advocacy took place. In the last sentence of the first paragraph, they more specifically mentioned the geographic location of the advocacy. And throughout the paragraph, they establish that FP-CIPs are an important tool that can have effective results. In the sections in red in the second paragraph, the author further describes why the topic and advocacy is important and highlights the issues that exist in the implementation of CIPs. They finish by describing how not enough attention has been given to how governments can drive internal accountability in order to progress towards achieving CIP targets, and explain that a decision maker-led self-assessment on policy implementation is critical in order to increase accountability. This sets them up in order to begin explaining their advocacy in the next section. Now let's look at the third main component of your abstract, the advocacy intervention section. This section should be no longer than 100 words. In this short section, you should describe the specific aims and objectives of your advocacy. It's the place where you also describe what you did, or in other words, what role your organization or institution played in addressing the issue, and if you had any other collaborators. Again, the why should be covered under the significance and background section. This section is where you describe the who, what, where, and when of your advocacy or accountability activities. I will give you a few seconds to read through this example from an abstract accepted at a previous ICFP. In the section highlighted in red, you can see that the author made sure to include who implemented the advocacy intervention, as well as when and where this happened. So now that you have clearly established your advocacy intervention, let's spend some time looking at what to cover in the methodology section. This section has a word limit of 200 words. The methodology section is where you should include the detail on how you applied your advocacy or accountability approach. For example, this includes what specific advocacy approach you used, who you targeted, how or why you chose them as a target, and details on location, data sources, or evidence used in your advocacy. Note anything about your location that might be relevant to the advocacy. Also, make sure to include specifics on the time frame and any intended beneficiaries. An inside tip on the methodology section is to spend a lot of time on it. It's an important section when reviewers score your abstract for quality, rigor, and validity of your work. The methodology and intervention sections are easily confused, so really carefully consider which information falls into which section. The best rule of thumb for that is that the intervention section describes the who, what, when, and where of your advocacy, and the methodology describes the how. I will give you a few seconds to read through this example from a previous ICFP and reflect on whether this section covers the elements that we just discussed. As highlighted, the authors went into a lot more detail about how they implemented the advocacy intervention described earlier in the intervention section. The authors cover what specific actions were taken, such as developing accountability work plans and conducting power mapping of decision makers. They also described the accountability tool in more detail and gave specifics on the location and timeframe. Now let's look at the results and key findings section. This section should be no longer than 250 words. This is also a very important section. It covers the outcomes of your advocacy and accountability activities and what changes occurred as a result of your advocacy. Include details on any funds allocated and any policy changes. If at all possible, also describe the impact from those changes, such as improvements in contraceptive uptake. An insight tip for this section is to make sure the results that you are reporting relate back to the aims of the advocacy activity that you mentioned in the intervention section. We also get a lot of questions about whether preliminary results and findings are acceptable, and they are. You should include as much detail on the results and findings as you have presently, and maybe mention what you expect to be able to report on by the time of the conference. I will give you a few seconds to read through this example and reflect on how it covers the elements that we just discussed. You can see that the authors describe the impact of using the tool and power mapping introduced earlier. Finally, let's discuss the last part of the abstract, or the policy or program implications section. This should be no longer than 250 words. This section is where you return back to the big picture. You should report what your results mean for your context, what are the next steps, what do the results mean for the wider advocacy field, could they be replicated in other countries, and what lessons can you pass along to other advocates? This is where you would include any key take-home messages. The biggest tip for this section is to not repeat your findings, rather interpret them. Answer questions like, how well did your outcomes address the initial problem? Are there gaps? What is needed next? Don't be afraid to discuss any limitations to your advocacy efforts. The conclusions you discuss in this section should be supported by the results and key findings sections. There shouldn't be any surprises or new information that wasn't mentioned previously. Again, I will give you a few seconds to read through this example and reflect on how it covers the elements that we just covered. Here, the author highlights some important takeaways. They tied the findings discussed earlier with wider concepts. In the second paragraph, They discuss key things to keep in mind as the program moves forward and discusses that the approach could be generalized to other settings or topics. Before we end with frequently asked questions, it is important to briefly discuss the important issue of research misconduct. It may be a surprise to many of you, but we have had a few incidences where applicants to ICFP were disqualified because of misconduct. Good research ethics is the core of scientific integrity. Any sign of misconduct is taken seriously during abstract review. Citations do not need to be included in the abstract submission. However, if language is clearly copied from other sources, it provides immediate grounds for disqualification. It's mandatory for any abstract submitter to avoid any form of fabrication, falsification, or plagiarism. We have provided here a link to the research ethics policy for the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health. These guidelines apply to all abstracts submitted to ICFP. We will now end with a few frequently asked questions. Probably the most common question, which abstracts are likely to be accepted for ICFP? This question is not as simple as it sounds. Your abstract is more likely to be accepted if it strictly follows the guidelines and word count, but ultimately, reviewers will judge the integrity and contribution of your work. Abstracts that skip sections or don't provide sufficient information are much less likely to be accepted. The Abstract Selection Committee tries to prioritize abstracts presenting new knowledge or evidence. Findings should be supported by the data, and a clear methodology should be presented, irrespective of the language in which the abstract is written. Abstracts in English or French languages are all treated equally. Ensure clarity of the language used in the abstract, and review your abstracts to make sure there are no typos or grammatical errors. It is okay to have someone review your abstract for English or French language editing. Another very common question we receive is, why does ICFP have 1,000-word abstracts, while other conferences often have abstracts that are 300 to 350 words? ICFP is unique in this way. Our main goal is to allow people to share new knowledge to inform practice. ICFP allows up to 1,000 words for individual abstracts and 400 words for abstracts submitted as part of a perform panel to provide sufficient details that allow the scientific committee to appropriately review the abstract and make a fair decision. Also allow abstract authors to clearly clarify the research questions and context and explain the methodology and results in detail. There are many do's and don'ts to have a successful abstract. First, make sure to stay on topic throughout your abstract. This is a conference on family planning. If your topic isn't related to family planning, it won't be accepted. Keep in mind the rule of 3, simple, clear, comprehensible. Avoid very long sentences and dense paragraphs. Do not use unusual terms and acronyms without defining them. And consider having your abstract reviewed by a native speaker of the language of your abstract before submission. Although this is common, please avoid passive voice. Consider using the present tense to describe the problems addressed by your abstract and implications of your advocacy. You should use past tense when describing methods used, results found, and any limitations and strengths. Please also never start a sentence with a number. These are all small tips, but they can help your abstract stand out. Remember, the abstract is about what you did, how you did it, what you found, what you learned, and why anyone should care. Don't try to summarize all content of the paper, just include what is necessary. I am sure you already know of many resources about writing an abstract, but here are a few that you may find useful if you would like to read more on what we discussed today. I would also really encourage you to read all of the winning abstracts from the last ICFP online. Thank you for your time. If you have any questions about abstract submissions, please do not hesitate to reach out. Thank you, and we hope to welcome you at ICFP.